All right, hey folks, it's Faz from Fazlifts, and today's video is going to be part 4 in the Hypertrophy Fundamentals series. But before that, make sure you like and subscribe and hit the bell notification. And if you are interested in coaching, there's a link in the description. So we have got a lot to talk about in this series. The first 3 videos were to do with volume, intensity, and then also the relationship between volume, intensity, and frequency. Now, if you've not seen those, go back and check those videos out. Just to give you guys a quick recap, in terms of volume, I recommend an average of about 8 to 16 sets per body part per week. There are some circumstances where you would land below that and some circumstances where you would land above that. Intensity, I recommend mostly training as close to failure as you can safely do. Now again, circumstances may dictate. Sometimes you go beyond failure and also sometimes you stay shy of failure. But for my general recommendations of volume, roughly training as hard as you can right up to failure is a good thing. If you were doing less volume, you might want to make it with more intensity, which gives you things like HIIT training. And if you were doing more volume, you might want to reduce the intensity a bit and do more sets across. But those are outside the boundaries of my recommendations for most people. There are some specific circumstances where that might be into play, but that's not what I'm talking about here in more of a general video to do with my recommendations. And finally, in terms of frequency, we're looking at about 2 to 3 times a week. That's my recommendation per body part per week. And again, certain situations where you might go above that. So I want to just kick this off with going through the various popular programs and popular routines and just trying to break down some of the mystery around those, because I think when you're not used to viewing things in terms of a principled top-down basis, you might be forgiven for thinking that all these routines are very different. If you're a full body is very different to an upper lower, which is very different to a push-pull legs. And that thinking can contribute towards people wanting to program hop because they think there's some kind of magic. The purpose of the first part of this video is to just demystify everything, so you guys can see routines for what they are. And that is just a selection and an arrangement of volume, intensity, sets, all that stuff. That's all. If we look at one of the most popular splits, the upper lower, typically speaking, people are training about 4 times a week with the upper lower. That means they're going to be doing about 4 to 8 sets per body part per session. And because we're looking at the average amount of volume, you generally want to just take those to the house as safe as you can. And you're going to train each body part about twice a week. So it perfectly satisfies the criteria that are laid out. There are certain situations where you have some variations. People might do upper lower 6 days a week, and so you have slightly more frequency, and as a result you have to balance the volume and pull back a little bit. Next routine would be the full body. Typically speaking, people are training full body about 3 or 4 days a week. Now if you train 3 days a week, you're looking at about 3 to 5 sets per body part per session. If you're training 4 days a week, you're looking at about 2 to 4 sets per body part per session. The frequency of 3 or 4 times a week, which is a step up from twice a week, does demand some type of variation. So whether that's intensity variation, whether it's exercise selection, repetition ranges, or rest period cycling. In general, the average way to train 3 to 4 days a week full body does still satisfy the criteria of the volume, the intensity. You do need to have a little more of an eye, I think, on variety and intensity cycling, but in general, it still satisfies the criteria. Push-pull legs, that's the next one. Typically speaking, people are going to be wanting to do that 6 days a week. I say 6 days a week because if you're training push-pull legs and you're only training 3 days a week, you could probably do something a bit more efficient like a full body or an upper lower. So in general, push-pull legs should be trained about 6 days a week. So what happens is you end up training each body part twice a week. Now, while I'm talking about push-pull legs, I'm also going to throw in the torso limb split because it's pretty much interchangeable. So torso limbs is chest and back on one day, delts and arms the next day, legs the next day. That's just a different way of arranging push-pull legs, very similar. It's a nice variation because you get to superset a lot, which is good. Superset chest and back, superset delts and arms. People sometimes refer to it as the Arnold split. Again though, 4 to 8 sets per body part per session. And once again, like the upper lower, take it to the house, just remain safe. And you're training each body part twice a week. So that's another common way to arrange things. And again, it satisfies the criteria. Next up, we've got the push-pull legs and upper lower. For people who like to train 5 days a week, it's a bit of an unusual split, but it works. Again, 4 to 8 sets per body part per session. take them to the house twice a week. Excellent. Now, the reason that I patiently went through all of these is so you can see from a top-down principle basis, there's a lot of things in common here. The frequency, the volume, and the intensity. They are just different ways of arranging those across the week. That's all they are. I want to go through all those common splits because I want to demystify this fantasy around a split being magical, because they aren't. As long as they mostly satisfy those criteria, there is no magic split. It's just a different way of arranging things. That's all. My goal over the last couple of minutes has been to get you guys to view routines by their parts and not their packaging. Because if you get taken in by the hype, then people will come up with all kinds of new routines which you can look at and critically evaluate and think, okay, actually, that routine doesn't make sense because Faz has taught me the principles behind what I should be looking for. And I know this special new split that someone's come up with actually looks pretty stupid because it doesn't satisfy the criteria. So that's the goal. So first important lesson, I want you guys to be able to recognize a good program by how it satisfies the basic criteria. First of all, you want to ask yourself, does it equally cover all areas? For example, a very common thing to do is exclude calves and abs. People do that all the time. There are some criticisms of the upper lower, for example. People will criticize the upper lower by saying the upper day is too bloated, the lower day is too easy. But typically speaking, those people are leaving out calves and abs almost entirely. So obviously, if you leave out half the routine on the day, then it's going to look like less. But again, if you know the principles, then you can look at these things and actually critically evaluate yourself and say, okay, no, that routine, rubbish. Next thing is, are volume, intensity, frequency covered based on my recommendations? So is it hitting each body part roughly about the same? About looking at about 8 to 16 sets per body part per week. And again, another very common one is to miss out or really reduce workload in some areas, but increase it in others, which can lead to problems. Like, for example, a common one is not doing anywhere near as much hamstring work relative to quad work. If you think about the old strong lifts kind of thing, like one deadlift set per many squat sets, that's a very unequal hamstring to quad ratio, and it can lead to knee problems for a lot of people. We have a similar situation when it comes to pressing. A lot of people really emphasize overhead and chest pressing, but they don't have sufficient back volume. And what that tends to do is lead to elbow problems. So you have all these things which, from my point of view, I can look at a program and think, do they satisfy the criteria? And if they do, they're probably going to be okay. If they don't, then more often than not, you hear people having a lot of problems on these routines with sore elbows, knees, back, all that kind of stuff. But it's painfully obvious why. So the first important lesson, does the program look good based on the principles? Now, the second important lesson from today is, following on from the first point, it's important to recognize that there is no magic routine. All a routine is just a selection of sets, reps, exercises, which hopefully should satisfy the overall principles, which you know now, because I've taught you. Now, that means program hopping is pointless, really, if you think about it. Because if your routine is pretty solid, then there's no magic in something else. If you're doing an upper lower and it is a good upper lower, it satisfies the principles, and you're not getting any gains, and you think, I want to try push-pull legs, maybe that will help. Actually, probably won't, because it's probably something else, because your program already satisfies the criteria. So if you understand these things, you understand there's no magic in routines. So it takes away the pull to switch routines, and you realize actually a routine is just a selection of sets and reps and intensity and all that stuff, so you can just carry on. And odds are, if you have a plateau, if you have a stall, it's probably not the routine, it's probably some implementation of the principles, which you can tweak, and you don't have to change the full routine. Like maybe you need a bit more volume, maybe you need a bit less volume, whatever, you get the idea. But there's no magic in routines, ergo that should reduce one of the main problems that people have with continued progress, which is routine changing, because they look for a solution in the wrong place. They change routine, which stalls their progress, but actually the real problem was something else. Maybe it was a lack of protein, maybe it was a lack of sleep, maybe it was a lack of adequate food, but they view the routine as a red herring. Hopefully that sort of explains a bit more about that and warns you against that very common mistake. Concluding thoughts, a routine really is nothing more than an arrangement of sets and reps. Think of it like Tetris. basically. You're just fitting parts together. It's literally like that. You're fitting together the volume in one area with the volume in another area with how to arrange it during the week. The Tetris board is your week, and you're just fitting the parts in, that's all. Make sure you don't miss anything out, okay, or you lose the game. But yeah, that's basically all it is. And when you judge a routine, try not to judge it based on hype and people selling it. Fitness industry is really ripe with this kind of stuff. A lot of people have very good sales techniques with selling their routines and programs. Try to avoid that. Just look at what the routine looks like from a principle basis, rather than getting caught up in the glitz, the glamour, the shouting, the loud voices. Just look at the principles. Remember, it's your training, it's your time. Time is not to be wasted. And also, finally, concluding thoughts, because routines which satisfy the criteria, which I've taught you in this video, are all mostly the same, a lack of progress is usually not related to the routine. It's usually related to another factor. Therefore, routine hopping is really not a good solution for anything. Right, folks, thank you very much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and your experiences, and I will speak to you in the next one. Peace out.